can't tell you the number of times that I will go to a school or I will go to a business who tells me, I run disaster drills all the time, Patrick. We don't need to worry about it. We're totally fine. Don't even worry about it. We're good. And so then I say to them, well, okay, tell me a little bit more about the drill you conducted. And then I say, well, we did the alert. Everybody got up from their desks and they went outside. We called roll. Everyone's there. We went back in. That's not an effective disaster drill at all. And that's one of the problems I see constantly, is that people are running what I like to call Shakespearean drills. So today I'm talking to you about Shakespearean drills. That's what I call them. I call them Shakespearean drills because you could almost choreograph this like a Shakespearean play. You have people entering stage left. The alarm, we notify everybody. So in this case, I'm going to use the example of a school. Okay, so I'm going to use it because it's easy, because schools do them all the time. They do them once or twice a year. Remember being a student. You remember doing them too. We all did them. Elementary school, junior high, and high school, and they got worse, much worse, the older you got, and the more annoying they were. Okay, so you'll have it. They'll say, everybody, there's a fire, so everybody go ahead and get up. And so everybody gets up out of the chair, and then they, assemble outside. They call roll, and everybody's chit-chatty, right? You know what I'm talking about. You've seen people on the lawn, students at the lawn. They're talking, they're laughing. They're glad to be out of science class, or they're out glad to not have to be in the math class, and they're going to get 15 minutes out, and then right afterward they're going to have lunch. So everybody's really just checked out. They don't really care. In high school, they actually did that. They actually timed the fire drills, so it was just before lunch, so that you didn't have to go back to the classroom. So you go in there, so you go and you grab your backpack, and then you go outside for the fire drill. I call it the disaster drill, but it really was a fire drill. And so you go outside for the fire drill. You're on the lawn, you and your friends. You're chatting about what you're going to do for lunch. Maybe even start eating lunch. I've seen that too. Then the fire drill's over, and everybody just disperses. They just go all over the place. Nobody knows what's going on. No one knows the implications. We didn't learn anything. Those are the most stupid, horrible drills I've ever seen. And if we do them, we are at fault if we are not ready for disasters. We need to insist that our schools and businesses and our faith-based organizations and all those institutions that matter to us, that they are running effective disaster drills. I emphasize this when I've worked with community theaters. I work with a lot of community theaters. I've done a lot of disaster plans for them, hundreds. And when I go to them and I say to them, we need to run an effective disaster drill for you because you're in a tornado zone, or you're in a hurricane zone, or you're in an earthquake zone, or you're in proximity to a chemical facility. We need to run a lockdown drill, a chemical lockdown drill. And they'll say, well, we've done that before. Okay, so let me see it. So they'll do it. They'll say, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to go over here. We say our part. Everybody says their lines. All clear. And then we're done. That's Shakespeare for you. It's all scripted. It doesn't mean anything. And then inevitably at the end of it, they'll have a sheet of paper that'll say, and a lot of times they don't even do this. Schools do it. Healthcare facilities do it. But not a lot of other places do it. And even then, they don't do anything. At schools and healthcare facilities, they'll have a sheet of paper which says, what did we do well? And I'll never forget this. I got a sheet one time and it said everything was done perfectly. Everything was done perfectly. That's literally what the person wrote. And I couldn't believe it. I've never heard of anybody with that much chutzpah to say that everything ran perfectly. We didn't need to fix anything. We didn't need to change anything. Everything went perfectly great. And I go, it didn't run great. You know how I know it didn't run great? Because you said it ran perfectly. That's how I know. That's how I know this went wrong. Very wrong. This drill went wrong because you said everything went perfectly. There is no drill. There's no drill on earth, period, that should ever run perfectly. If it runs perfectly, you did something wrong. When I would train EMTs, and I trained them sometimes on hazardous materials, when we trained on hazardous materials, I told them, okay, we're going to drill on this, and we would do a drill, and they would come back in the next year, and these are people who are experienced responders. These are people who worked in factories sometimes, and they were very good. We'd run a drill, and inevitably, something would mess up. It always is like that. People who are in the military understand this better than most, because they know that when you're trying to conduct some kind of military operation where there's a specific objective, you have either an operational or a strategic or tactical objective, then those things inevitably things go wrong. And the more people are involved, the more likely it is that things are not going to run perfectly. There are things that have to be constantly improved. But when people run these Shakespearean drills like I see at schools all the time, I get really annoyed because the administrators get ridiculously arrogant about them. They say, well, we know how to do this. We've done this 100 times. And I say, well, okay, so what would happen if teacher X were not available, or people are screaming, or people are hiding in bathrooms? And what if people refuse to do what you say? And what if there are people injured? And what if these are children? They go, oh, we can't do that, Patrick. We can't do that. You can't do that. We don't want to traumatize anybody. Right now, I'm actually working with 2 scholars because I'm planning to solve this problem. I've heard that rejoinder so many times that right now, July, I am working with 2 different professors, 2 scholars from 2 different universities. We are developing, and we're actually going to test out what we call a trauma-informed disaster drill. Meaning, we can conduct a disaster drill in a location that has experienced a horrible disaster of some kind that may have resulted in fatalities, and we can run it with the triggers in mind. In other words, that we know that people are going to be triggered. That we know that it's going to be difficult to them because they remember what happened the last time that particular disaster occurred. But let me make it clear. It's not an excuse not to run a drill because people are afraid. If you do that, you are setting them up for failure. I know that sounds tough, and it is. I intend it to be. I say that because it doesn't mean it's impossible. It can't be done. You can run a trauma-informed disaster drill. That can be done. You can do it in a way that doesn't scare people. Now, before I go any farther, I want to mention something. Today, and as you know, I don't really talk about, I'm not a security expert, so I don't really talk about mass shooter drills. So a lot of things I'm talking about today, I understand that it's a different calculus when you're talking about mass shootings. But I will say this, though. I have run mass shooter drills before. I have done them because when I work in healthcare facilities, when I work with education, I've worked with a lot of charter schools in California, for example, you have to run mass shooter drills. When we've done those, I tell you the one thing we do not do is we don't do it without there being significant psychological support beforehand and afterwards. We also don't do things like we don't do real gunshots. We don't do fake gunshots. We don't do, like I was at a school one time and they were firing shots in the air through a track gun, and we don't do that. I don't do that kind of stuff, and you shouldn't. And mass shooter drills, there are ways to conduct them. But what I'm talking to you about today are natural disasters or technological disasters, chemical spills or plane crashes or whatever. Those do happen. That impacts businesses. These are things that can be very, very traumatic, and they can cause people a lot of difficulty in working in the drill itself. And so I'm on kind of a mission because for me, I understand and know that these things can be very traumatizing for folks, but that we do have to run them because it's going to repeat. And that's been the problem, though. I've seen that way too often. I see it where people are just too afraid to run the drill, so what they do is they run a Shakespearean drill, or they're just being lazy. They just decide, you know what, I don't want to go through all this. I had a facility I was working with. It was a nursing home in Pennsylvania. And the first year I ran a drill, we went all out, and it was really great. We learned a lot. I wrote a report. We got a ton of things. We fixed a bunch of stuff. Then the second year, the administrator walks up to me and says, we don't want to do what we did last year. It traumatized the staff. So we're just not going to do it. I want to do it at about half the level we did last time. And I said, I don't really want to do that, but if you insist. Then the next year was, we're doing it at about an eighth of the size and scope of last time. And I said, why did you hire me? Why did you bring me here? And I say this now to school administrators. And my mother, when she was a principal, she was a tough lady. The kids loved her. She's one of those people who the kids really loved her and everything else, but they understood my mother was all about accountability and was all about making sure that people understood what the expectations were. But my mother always, always, always treated those kids tremendously well. And I will say that when I look at school administrators, I understand entirely what they're going through. They got a lot going on, but that doesn't mean that we can't do it. And I have a series of videos I'm going to be putting out in September because that's when school really starts ramping up. I know schools start before September, but I want to give people a little bit of time to settle in. And then I got a couple of ideas for you, a couple of videos I'm going to put up on how you should run simple, effective disaster drills for schools, for work, for faith-based organizations, etc. And when I talk to you about all the different elements of a disaster drill, I will tell you that there is a simple solution. There is a way, but you have to commit to it. And the commitment you need to make to it is you have to commit to the fact that this needs to simulate the real thing to some extent. It doesn't mean you have to turn your entire office into chaos. I'm going to South Dakota pretty soon, and when I go there, I'm running a disaster drill there, and everyone understands it's going to be realistic. I told them that. It's going to be realistic. But we need to know that when we are involved in drills, when we are planning drills, when we are involved with drills, they need to be as realistic as possible, or they are a waste of time for us. They don't help what we're trying to do. It's a disservice to how we do things. I was working with a school one time who said, we don't want to get the kids too riled up. What do you think is going to happen in a disaster? This was in Orange County. This was in a place called Laguna Niguel. It's a beautiful location. I grew up near there. Many of you know I grew up in a place called Mission Viejo, California, which is a wonderful location. It's a wonderful place to grow up. It's a wonderful place for people to get married and start a family. And it is the worst place imaginable if you want to be a disaster professional. Just awful, because not a lot happens there. I'll knock on wood. Okay, there. I knocked on wood. But the issue I had was when I got asked to work with this school in Laguna Niguel, they said, will you come and help us with the drill? I said, fine. They ran the drill. And I said, this drill was a waste of time. You didn't challenge these kids. You didn't challenge your staff. You didn't challenge anyone to do anything difficult. So as a result, I don't know what you're expecting. You're no more prepared now than you were 30 minutes ago. You're no more prepared now than you were 15 minutes ago. In fact, you're actually less prepared. That's the major problem. When we run Shakespearean drills in our schools, in our businesses, in the places we care about, then we are doing ourselves a disservice. We are making ourselves less prepared because we are giving ourselves a false sense of security. Because when we do that, it's like we're playing baseball. Okay, so imagine we're a baseball team and we decided that, we want to test it out. We want to see how well we are. And so we decide we're only going to field ourselves. So imagine, for example, that we're a basketball team. Okay, so we're a basketball team. So there's, 5 of us, and we decide we're going to play. So we're all one team, but we don't have another team. There's no other team there. It's just us by ourselves on the court. So, of course, we're going to be able to slam dunk. Of course, we're going to be able to do every possible basket that we've ever thought about with 0 consequences. Because if we miss, we're just going to grab it, give it to ourselves, and try again. We can try anything we want. We can do anything we want because it's nothing hard. You ever watch Home Run Derby before? Well, in baseball, it's just basically they're just throwing, 70-mile-an-hour baseballs at these guys who are used to just hitting home runs. Of course they're going to hit home runs. It's designed for them to hit home runs. Because they're not competing against anybody. They're not getting curveballs. They're not getting screwballs. They're not getting sliders. They're not getting high and tight. It's right down the middle. It's designed to do that. But going back to the basketball analogy, if we're a basketball team not playing against anyone, we're doing ourselves a disservice by saying we just scored like 500 points in a game. When we run Shakespearean drills, we're scoring 500 points in a game. And then when the ground starts shaking, when the wind starts blowing, when we have to really do real things, things suddenly change. Mike Tyson, who is a boxer, he had a wonderful quotation. I think it sometimes gets overused, but I think it is tremendously applicable here. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And what he meant by that is that, of course, when we're shadowboxing, we're Muhammad Ali. When we are in the gym and we are just hitting up against a bag, we are getting them left and right. Every punch is landing just right. And even when they don't land, who cares? Because I got a right hook or I got an uppercut. My dad was a big boxer. He didn't actually box himself as an adult. He did as a kid. But my father followed boxing throughout his entire life. And my dad used to tell me about, it's easy to be able to, land these right hooks and uppercuts on various kinds of bags. But when you're actually competing against somebody who is putting their guard up, they're moving around, there's a zillion elements involved, and your concentration is broken. There's people around you yelling in the atmosphere, and you're nervous and all these things. All of a sudden it changes. And in addition to that, they can punch you. They can attack you. So that changes the way you're going to react. It's going to change the way you behave. And that's why it's so important that when boxers are training, that they actually spar against real partners, real people who can fight back. You're not just hitting the heavy bag. You're not just hitting the speed bag. You're actually going out there and you're competing with somebody. You're actually sparring with them. That's really important to realize because it can have an impact. Because if you go out there for the first time and you've only been hitting the heavy bag or you've just been hitting the speed bag and you've been doing everything right, and then you're suddenly in the ring with someone who is just as good as you are, except they've actually been in the ring with other people before, you are going to have a heck of a wake-up call because it's going to change you when they hit you in the face for the first time. That's going to be really, really important. Dwight Eisenhower was one of our greatest generals, and later he was a president. For those of you who don't know, Dwight Eisenhower was a general in World War II. And what's interesting about him was that at the time of World War II, at the time he became the supreme commander, he'd never heard a bullet fired in anger in his entire life. Not once. And one of the things that FDR, the president at the time, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR for short, and FDR was really worried about the potential for an American ground invasion of Europe because at the time the United States D-Day was years away, but he understood that in the end, if Nazism and fascism were going to be defeated in Europe, that the United States and the Allies were going to have to launch an amphibious invasion into Europe. An amphibious invasion meaning where troops are landed directly from an amphibious vehicle. They were actually called Higgins boats. My grandfather was actually one of the people, he actually used to drive the Higgins boats in the invasion of Italy. And so Dwight Eisenhower was very green, and FDR realized this, and so he overruled all the generals. He overruled everybody when he decided that the United States was going to attempt an amphibious landing in North Africa. And North Africa was interesting at the time because North Africa was being ruled by the Vichy French, which the Vichy French were essentially Nazi collaborators, but essentially they fought half-heartedly because they weren't the hardened Wehrmacht, meaning they were not the regular German troops. And so what FDR decided was that if he is going to launch this massive invasion in D-Day, they have to drill and try this out. And so what they had actually done is practices on American beaches. And they, of course, there's no real enemy there, right? They're just not fighting anyone. They're just getting off the boats. But he decided, what we're going to do is we are going to do a test invasion in North Africa, simulating what it would be like as if it were D-Day. And it was awful. It was supposed to be a support for Operation Torch. And so what happened was the amphibious vehicles came out. But here's the thing. Instead of opening up in the front, and if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan or you've ever seen those Higgins boats, you'll see that they drop from the front and then people come out. That's not the way the Higgins boats worked when they went to North Africa. You didn't go out the front. You had to jump over the side. So these men jumped into the ocean and then had to swim or wade in waters up to their chest, up to get to the front. That's not exactly the best and most efficient way of getting light infantry off of an amphibious landing. Second of all, most of the tanks, when they were rolled off of the boats, their circuits fried for a variety of reasons, and the main one was because of the amount of heat. If you've ever been to North Africa before, you will know how hot it truly is. So some of them also fell in the water, and it was a real mess. It was terrible, and it set us up for a series of battles. The Battle of Kasserine Pass, which was, and there's just no doubt about this, that was Battle of Kasserine Pass was a massive disaster for the United States. That landing was a disaster for the United States. But it provided some wonderful lessons, though, because the mistakes they made then, they fixed them so that when D-Day occurred, all of a sudden, instead of having light infantry that had only fought against quote-unquote phantom soldiers in North Carolina where they were training, or Florida, instead, they'd been to North Africa. Yes, they'd fought troops. Yeah, they weren't the elite troops, but at least they understood and had some battle experience now. They fixed the Higgins boat, so now you come out the front. They fixed the tanks. And they fixed the APCs, the armored personnel carriers, where they weren't getting fried in the water. So that as soon as they landed out, they could be immediately used. Those were the kinds of things that got fixed. And they wouldn't have been very effective if they'd have continued doing fake drills. So when you're doing your Shakespearean drills, I want you to think, are you really preparing yourself for real battle? Because what's going to happen when you get punched in the face for the first time? Or you land on that foreign beach for the first time and you're facing real troops for the first time? Or when you are a basketball team of 5 people who are suddenly, you have opponents. And you may think to yourself, well, we have opponents. And I go, who? If you run a school, you need to show teachers unable to walk. You need to show people laying on the ground. You need to show children who refuse to leave the classroom. That happens in real life. You need to show parents showing up, picking up their kids, and not telling anyone. Parents do that constantly. They will go to schools and they will grab their children. That happens so often that it's almost a cliche in disaster management. And I want you to be in a position that you understand what the real dynamics are like in disasters. And you may have been in them. That's what's even more surprising, because I'll go to schools and they'll say, well, we've been through these before, we know the drill. Do you? That tells me that you're not doing the right thing. If you know the drill, then you know the drill. You should make it a drill you don't know. The don't know drill is what's going to make you better, make you stronger, challenge you. We need to, when we do these drills, we need to be prepared to fail. We need to be prepared to go out there and do things that are going to be less than successful. Why? It makes us stronger. It makes us better. It gives us realistic conditionalities for when the real disaster is going to occur. That is why I emphasize that this highly. I'm going to have videos up very shortly that is going to give you some examples so that when we go into these drills, we understand the expectations. I have a blog article I'm putting up on LinkedIn very soon where it's talking about what we need to do when we work for somebody and they don't ever run drills. Do we need to do them ourselves? And the answer is an unequivocal yes, we have to. We have to take that responsibility. What have I said every single episode? We have to know how to evacuate, shelter in place and lockdown everywhere we go. If you do no other disaster preparedness, you need to be able to know how to evacuate, shelter in place, and lockdown. And the method I use for answering how to maximize that is what I call the 5-pocket method. We're not getting into it today because we've talked about it many times. But what I mean by that is, if we're going to conduct a drill that we think is important, that we think is going to be the most effective for ourselves and our teams, then we have to put ourselves under real conditionalities. No 500-point basketball games. No more speed bags. No more heavy bags. Okay? No more amphibious landings in North Carolina. We need to go to the beaches in Africa, and we need to go after real troops. We need to go to a real boxing match where we are up against real opponents. We need to spar with them. We need to ask people who are going to challenge us. The best people I've ever seen, I've been a competitive guy my whole life, and so when I was on competitive teams, I always emphasized we need to take on the most difficult opponents who will come here and scrimmage with us, because that is how we are going to get better. That's how we all proceed in our careers, right? That's how we always improve. That's what we emphasize to our children when they're in sports. Take on difficult opponents, you will get better. When we go to school, we work on harder lessons because we want to get better. It should be no different for the disaster drills that we participate in every single organization with which we have affiliation. We need to constantly push ourselves. The more that we do that, the better we're going to be. Because if we continue to do these Shakespearean drills where it's like stage left, stage right, so-and-so says this, so-and-so says that, draw a curtain, then we are not putting ourselves in a position for what the real conditions are going to be like in a real disaster. This is Disaster Patrick, and remember, prepare for a disaster, and you'll never experience one, even in a drill.